la foi ou la non-foi s'exprime avec honnêteté dans le respect de la foi ou de la non-foi des autres. Donc pour moi, revenir à la question et revenir à l'ignorance partagée, c'est toujours très important. Parce que nous avons tous les mêmes questions, mais nous avons des réponses différentes. Les réponses nous singularisent, les réponses nous différencient. Mais n'oublions pas que nous avons la question en commun. Et que c'est cette question qui nous fait homme. Et c'est cette question qui nous fait semblable. Et notre fraternité, elle est celle de la question et du doute.
Today we have Professor Norman Cornett, who has been prolifically for several years having what are called dialogic sessions with renowned filmmakers, artists, philosophers, and other very important people, creating a sort of town hall in Montreal, something very unique in a place where we definitely need a public space and public discussion. We have invited Professor Cornett here today to discuss a film called L'Heureux Naufrage, made by Guillaume Tremblay. And Professor Cornett will be holding a dialogic session on September 22nd with the filmmaker and other people who were in the film. Could you maybe just start talking a little bit about yourself and about your field of expertise, and then maybe a little bit about the town hall, which is coming?
Well, yes, for 23 years now I've led what I call dialogic sessions. And in all fairness here, I'm referencing Mikhail Bakhtin, the Soviet literary critic, and his notion of the dialogic imagination. I believe that learning takes place in the interstice between our imaginations and our reasoning. And I want to bring the best available experts to the most number of people possible. So I create these dialogic sessions. It's essentially creating a public space where everyday people, as Sly and the Family Stone would say, can meet the philosophers such as Charles Taylor, you were with us for that, or internationally renowned composers such as Tord Gustavsen from Norway, you were with us for that. And in the case of Guillaume Tremblay and the documentary L'Heureux Naufrage, the English title is Fortunate Shipwreck. It's been their English subtitles, and I'm also a professional translator, so when I saw the translations, I realized how good they were. And so on the 22nd of September at 7 o'clock in the evening this year, at St. John the Evangelist Church, which is in the Quartier des Spectacles, Place des Arts Metro. And I purposely choose that location because it's central. First of all, part of making these kind of people and ideas available for public debate is keying in with public transportation. St. John the Evangelist, you walk out of Place des Arts Metro and you're right there.
Of course, yeah.
I have a concern there too, because as of next year, in 2015, there will be more elderly people in Canada than there are young people. Ironically, the future of education lies with the elderly. And I'm quite struck about how many so-called retirees or senior citizens keep themselves mentally, intellectually active. So, and then at the same time, we want to bridge what I call the generation gap. So part of making these dialogic sessions accessible is I find a location in the Quartier des Spectacles and I approach the people and I say, here's a major figure, whether a philosopher, filmmaker, composer, musician. We'd like to do this. Does this interest you? With the understanding that no matter who it is, it never costs more than $5.
Of course, yeah.
And that's part of Jeremy Bentham, the School of Utilitarianism. How do you do the most good to the most number of people?
And your background is that you were a professor of religion, or?
Yes, my specialty is religious studies.
Okay.
Now, I did my PhD thesis on the history of religion, culture, and politics in Quebec society,
course, yeah. And that's one of
which is very much a focal point of the documentary Fortunate Shipwreck, or L'Heureux Naufrage in French. And because I was working on the relationship between religion and culture, that led me to work with the concept of D.W. Winnicott, the seminal British child psychiatrist. Now, Winnicott wanted to understand, how does a newborn babe, I mean literally right out the womb, make the relationship between the womb and the world, between the internal and the external? Talk about culture shock. Birth is culture shock. So how does a newborn relate? Well, D.W. Winnicott proposed this idea of what he called transitional objects. In popular culture, you think of the comic strip Peanuts. Linus's blanket is a transitional object. And in the studies of D.W. Winnicott, of course, the mother's breast is the transitional object, enabling the newborn to make that connection between the internal and the external. Well, my research expands on that notion, and I in fact maintain that the arts create a transitional space between the material and the spiritual realms, so that the aesthetic constitutes the threshold of spirituality, which has led me to lead dialogic sessions in all of the arts, with novelists, with poets, short story writers, sculptors, painters, because I'm exploring that transitional space.
Interstices.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And on that note, and if we could maybe just take that idea of a transitional object and jump right into the discussion regarding the film. The film, of course, being being subtitled in English, the Postmodern Society, and the whole idea of a sense of emptiness that people have in living in postmodern society. And of course it focuses on Quebec, so if we could just begin right away with that. Quebec in a sense had its own transitional object for a while, and that might be considered the Catholic Church. The language of the film begins with the real corporeal control that the Church beset upon early Quebec society, with real power, knowledge, social conditioning that was imposed on Quebec society by the Church. Being a specialist in Quebec society's religious frameworks and history, can you give us just a very brief set of comments on such impositions, or a little background on that kind of a social conditioning, power, knowledge, sort of ideology, if you will, that was characteristic of Quebec up to the 1960s, and how believers in Quebec were told there was only one way they could believe. And if you could give a little background about that.
Indeed. The subtitle in English, the director and the production company asked me, because I'm a professional translator, to propose. They had an idea, and you'll notice in French the subtitle is somewhat different. I proposed as the subtitle of Fortunate Shipwreck, the ambient emptiness of postmodern society. And what has led to this, as you quite rightly point out, Mr. Oscar, the documentary opens with essentially a footnote. At the time of the conquest, we're talking 1759, 1760, the French government left and the British came in, and essentially the Church fills in that vacuum. I would argue that one could propose a midwife metaphor, that the Roman Catholic Church midwifed the French descendants. Now, part of this vacuum was that created a remarkable space for the Roman Catholic Church. They were filling in the gap, and right up until the Quiet Revolution, we're talking the 1960s as it's known, the Quiet...
From 1760?
Yeah, it increases. It gets, because of course society is growing, demographically the population is growing. Remembering that Quebec, or French Canada as was called until the Quiet Revolution in the 1960s, had one of the highest birth rates, not just in Canada, not just in North America, but in the entire developed world.
Okay.
So, who is taking care of this growing Francophone population? Well, the Catholic Church is doing it. And they're doing it, there's something quite interesting here. it's where the rubber meets the road in religion, because now I'm an American by birth and by education, graduate of the University of California, Berkeley, and we would always think in terms of health, education, and welfare. They were taken care of by the state, either the individual states or the federal government. Until the Quiet Revolution.
Oh, wow, okay.
All health issues,
oh, wow.
all education issues, all social welfare, they're being taken care of by the Roman Catholic Church.
Oh, in Quebec.
Here in Quebec.
Oh,
and
wow,
the flip side of this is there are no unions.
Right.
There are no salaries.
Right.
So you basically have a pool, a labor pool of tens of thousands of free labor.
Wow.
And they're using it in the hospitals, the nurses, they're using it in the schools, they're using it in when food banks and the like. So the Quiet Revolution of the 1960s is what Harold Kuhn in the sciences called, but now we've adopted this expression, it's a paradigm shift in Quebec society. We're moving, the church is divested of health, education, and welfare, and the state. Now, of course, what this means is the Quebec state now starts to assume full-faceted nationhood, not to say nationalism.
Interesting. The film moves, you know, as you said, the subtitle being the ambient emptiness of postmodern societies. The film moves from those first scenes where it talks about this, which you've highlighted in a very concrete way, the complete control the Catholic Church stranglehold had over the society. It moves after that into several sort of popular singers in Quebec, like Yvon Deschamps, who speaks about what happens after that, after the 1960s. Yvon Deschamps, Quebec's singer, says that after the 1960s, there's a hole in this life. Something is missing. Ariane Moffat, the Quebecois singer, says, there's an emptiness I want to fill. And one thinker in the film talks about, Denise Bombardier says, we are devoid of answers, devoid of a path, and we are searching. We're all looking for direction right now. And of course, the Father Lacroix speaks about how will we get out of this. Granted that this definitely, and we can go back to this, that this definitely is a sort of I would say a global sort of sensation, this sort of emptiness, this ambient emptiness, the malaise in modern life. Is there something specific, maybe, perhaps, to Quebec in this regard? Because when somebody reads the Bouchard-Taylor report, one of the things that comes out of the Bouchard-Taylor reports is the idea of a spiritual void. And one of the things that I was interested in looking at the film was, and I will quote from the Bouchard-Taylor report, is that there were controversies surrounding prayers prior to municipal council meetings. The crucifix in the National Assembly and Christmas rituals, largely provoked by Quebecers of French-Canadian origin, have been perceived as threats to national traditions. There is a groundless impression that most immigrants appear to be fervent believers and that their culture is sustained by a more substantial or robust foundation. And this has highlighted a feeling of symbolic void that afflicts certain French-Canadian Quebecois. This is from the Bouchard-Taylor report. Can you maybe just say something about this? Because I know that there is definitely an emptiness, a global sort of emptiness in this era, but there definitely is this sort of spiritual void that is specific to Quebecois society, especially in regards to the others that live in the society and the traditions that they may feel they're more comfortable with.
Well, we have a lot to deal with here. First, a preface, when you mention Yvon Deschamps, Ariane Moffat, and others, on the website of L'Heureux Naufrage, fortunate shipwreck, in fact, they had 60 hours of footage.
Wow. Okay.
So, of course, you can't get that all into the documentary, so they have set up, as you've clearly done the research, they have set up interviews that everybody can consult on the website, extensive, indeed deep interviews with the individuals you've mentioned here. and Denise Bombardier actually opens up the documentary in many respects, and she's with another group of journalists, and she, at the end, calls for a spiritual revolution in Quebec to meet the need that you have just highlighted. There's several things one can say here. First of all, you're pointing out in the segues with your first question, you asked about Quebec society. Indeed, Quebec society constitutes a focal point in the documentary. What fascinates me as a religious studies scholar is that it is in effect a case study, a microcosm, and then almost by concentric circles, it moves out looking at North American society, and there's a reason that Denis Arcand, the Oscar-winning filmmaker, is there, because Denis Arcand is an acute observer, not just of Quebec society, remembering his film, The Decline of the American Empire. He situates Quebec squarely within the North American geopolitical and cultural space. And so that's what happens in this documentary. And then the concentric circles continue to expand, and here we are dealing with Western Europe and prominent philosophers such as André Comte-Sponville, who is an avowed atheist. He makes it crystal clear in the film. And therein lies one of its strength. This is a chorus of voices. We're not hearing just one tune. We're hearing atheists, we're hearing agnostics, we're hearing people who are, such as you rightly point out, Benoît Lacroix, who's a Dominican and a medievalist scholar of renown. And then you hear Eric Emmanuel Schmitt,
of course,
one of the top writers in Francophone literary circles, and the editor-in-chief of l'Encyclopédie des Religions, Frédéric Lenoir. Again, this is a noted philosopher, and who have that critical distance from religion, and indeed from Quebec society. And that brings us full circle to your pithy question, because in fact, by beginning with the particular case of Quebec society and then opening up, we see the big picture of Western society's emptiness. And in philosophical terms, we speak of the universal and the particular. And I think therein lies the dynamic of this documentary. It begins with the specific, with the particular, and then it builds on that to reach the universal. And by universal, we mean, in philosophical terms, the particular is a specific space and time. The universal is what is true in all times, in all places. And that, much of the documentary then addresses the issue of values. What values does everybody, whether they're...
And where do you get them from?
Exactly. Whether they're atheists, whether they're agnostic, whether they are believers, whether they are scholars, or whether they are popular entertainers, what values hold us together? And I find that that's quite salutary. This society, 1 year ago today, what happened?
We know.
The Charter of Values. But when you situate, when you locate values, what everybody holds dear within the context of an election, when you make those values serve a political agenda, when they become hostage to an electoral campaign, to what extent are we really dialoguing about that which each of us considers sacred, no matter what our belief system or lack thereof is?
I guess that would, be a good segue to sort of move to definitely the more universal discussion. And one of the things that interested me in the film is this call, and it seems like there is a kind of a call and response, and you definitely are responding to the call in the film. One economist named Leopold Lozon in the film speaks of there being no place to take a step back, to contemplate, to meditate, to introspect, to do what I call prayers. But then it's interesting because not so much as a oppositional statement, but complementary. Bernard Aymon, whose contribution I found extremely exhilarating, an anthropologist and filmmaker, talks about a presence. He says, and of course, as I just said, Léopold Lauzon says that there's, speaks of no place to step back, contemplate, meditate. But then on the other hand, Aymon does speak about, it sometimes happens that I feel a presence. I feel in nature when listening to Bach or Mozart or before the beauty, the intelligible of the world, or kind of gesture. Maybe there's a presence, maybe it's just a delusion, I've created the illusion of the presence myself. One of the things that I think that the film brings up is this idea of another system of believing. And this is sort of one of the reasons that I really wanted to speak to you, because you've read these, you've led dialogic sessions on this. Can you speak about this? Because there's believing, there's the belief systems that come from ideological systems. Then there's believing as a sort of a system which is not supported by social conditioning. Can you speak a little bit about that with the film?
Well, this leads us into another philosophical concept. And what is philosophy about? And what does it have in common with theology? Because there are some noted theologians in the film as well, as philosophers. And what they have in common, and what everybody in this documentary has in common, is what's termed in philosophy ultimate questions.
Okay.
What's our reason for being? What's the meaning of life? Both on the personal level and on the collective, on the societal plane. And we see this panoply of individuals from so many different walks of life, from different cultures. France certainly is quite a different than Quebec, even though they have a language in common. And this is where you opened your question with Léopold Lauzon, the economist. Again, in a philosophical vein, Socrates said, "The life unreflected is not worth living." And that's what this film does. It impels us to take a step back and reflect. And I appreciate that as a scholar. The film gives no answers. It opens with doubts and it closes with questions. It doesn't spoon feed us anything, but rather, and that's where its discursive, its dialogic element comes into place. Because it's inviting us, both as individual people, persons, and as groups, as communities, as a society, to reflect on values. And it's taking it out of that pressure cooker of politics and saying, if we have the necessary distance, both what I call psychological distance and chronological distance, what is it? What are the answers to those ultimate questions of what's the meaning of life? What's our reason for being?
I mean, just to sort of rephrase what I was asking, is the philosopher Slavoj Žižek speaks about how we've come to a point in the world where the system has lost its self-evidence. It's lost its automatic legitimacy. And he talks about how the field is now open. I do wish that the film might have examined the examination of the possibilities of other spaces and just started to suggest other spaces where ideologies hold has been destabilized. Not just the impossibilities of other spaces. That's what I was saying with Léopold Lauzon's question, comment, that there was no place to take a step back. Because to be sure, there are new forms of believing which are not part of an ideological system that are out there. It might be kids going to raves, which may seem like sort of very ephemeral things. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because you have led discussions with jazz musicians like Tord Gustafsson, and I believe that when we had a discussion on this, the way that some of the people reacted to his music showed that there definitely are other systems out there, or anti-systems. And that's what I would like you to address a little bit, because they were believers in his music. They were believers in other spaces where the sacred exists. And I do wish the film might have looked a little bit more into that.
Yeah, it's a point well taken. This is, in fact, what led me as a religious studies scholar to explore the relationship between aesthetics and spirituality. Because it has, one can argue that religion in the doctrinal, dogmatic, institutional sense in Western society, including in Quebec, doesn't hold water anymore. In fact, Frédéric Lenoir it makes a acute observation. He says, look what's happened here. There are three major systems of thought, three ideologies. First, it was the institutional religion, no longer considered valid. Then it was communism, which has been undermined. He says, and now free market capitalism has lost its grip, and it's having environmental and ecological effects that are worldwide for the planet. So where do we go now? How do we get our bearings as a person, as a people, as a society, and André Comte-Sponville even says, as a culture, indeed as a civilization. What is our frame of reference now? How do we build, how do we construct a new frame of reference?
And those frames are out there already.
We're looking for them,
because
and we're finding them.
African Americans were able to take, and people of African descent in the Americas were able to take Christianity and make it into a liberating theologies through syncretic means. And that's one of the things that I don't think the film addresses. The fact that Christianity definitely has had this hold, but there have been ways in the past that people have created. Do you want to speak about that?
Well, indeed, you're rightly pointing out, if we think of Latin America, you know, the liberation gospel, or before, as it was called at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, the social gospel, you know, liberation theology, Gustavo Gutierrez, and all. So yes, there are many. In all fairness to the filmmaker, the strength of the film is how it keeps its focus. And we're in a very broad field here. It could have dispersed, and it could have dissipated the impact. It focuses very clearly on what you have put your finger on, Mr. Oscar, and that's the emptiness. It's the vacuum of values.
Granted, yeah.
It's that sense of what's missing. We've got everything, and yet we know what's most important is missing. Now, as a historian by training, my methodology is historical. What strikes me in that film is to look at the development of Western society. You see, if we begin at the Reformation Renaissance period, you know, we're talking here the 1400s, 1500s, or 15th, 16th century, as it said, if you're a historiographer. What was the thrust? Because they realized even then that Christianity had so much baggage that what counted, the values of love, of compassion, of concern, of kindness, of forgiveness, that there were so much had been added on that you could not see the forest for the trees anymore. And so there was a movement, and this was part of, it went with linguistics. Linguistics.
This is in the Middle Ages?
In the Renaissance,
Okay.
Because they realized that even the Latin, the Bible they're reading in Latin. But the original manuscripts were not in Latin.
So there was a move against the ideological sort of...
There was a move against what had happened to both the institution and the doctrines that were really, had distorted the original. And so what became the watchword of the Renaissance and of the Reformation, the Latin expression is ad fontes, back to the sources, back to the fountains. And I see the documentary Fortunate Shipwreck, L'Heureux Naufrage, as essentially a postmodern call to go back to the sources, back to the fountainhead. It's a postmodern ad fontes. Let's get beyond the dogmas, beyond the institutional religion, and let's go back to the poetry of these values. And so in that sense, if we could accomplish that, we're going to need new concepts, we're going to need new language, but we can take those original creative thoughts and we can make them our own. Okay. We can appropriate them. And it's quite clear now that, as I mentioned as a historian, when I look at what's happened in Western civilization, the Renaissance and Reformation held out so much hope. To all intents and purposes, we're talking a revolution of ideas, a revolution in religion, hence Protestantism, for example. And then you move from the Renaissance Reformation and the 1600s, 17th century for historiographers, is what's characterized as the Age of Faith. And incredible blossoming of the faith in much of the great art of Western society comes from this period. Then what happens in the 17th century, in the 1700s, the 18th century, it's called the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment. Right. Rationalism kicks in, and rationalism begins to challenge, is there revelation? Is there divine? Is there supernatural? In fact, is there spiritual? Does it even exist? Right. And then comes along in the 1800s, because of science and the progress, of course, Charles Darwin. This is what Harold Kuhn calls, in his History of Science, a paradigm shift. Now, there's a tendency to make everything a matter of science. Indeed, why do we call them the social sciences? Right. We want everything based on hard data, verifiable. But Augustine said it best in antiquity. And I hear echoes of this in Fortunate Shipwreck. Augustine said, and keep in mind this is one of the great philosophers of antiquity, he's the first one to write a book that moderns and postmoderns still read, the Confessions. He also wrote The City of God. What is the relationship between religion and society? Right. This is the first great treatise in Christianity. But Augustine said, the heart has reasons which reason does not know. So what happens in the wake of this emphasis on science? Well, and rationalism. The response to the Age of Reason was in the early 1800s, Romanticism. Of course. Yeah. Both in music, for example, in Schumann, or in literature, Chateaubriand, and we could go on. Because they're reacting, if you reduce the human condition to a matter of reason, we're not doing justice to the full-orbed human condition. And that's where somebody like André Malraux in 1933, and I mention him specifically. With the Musée Imaginaire. And he wrote his seminal work in 1933, La condition humaine, the human condition. Why did it come then? Because André Malraux has just lived through, in fact, all of this generation are called the lost generation, because they were caught between World War I and World War II. Hemingway is part of the lost generation, for example. Yeah. You see, and there's an excellent study by David Spadafora, published by Yale University Press, entitled The Idea of Progress. Because the whole idea of progress is the child of the Age of Reason, of the Enlightenment. So Western society goes from the Reformation, moving to the Age of Reason, and then science. Right up until the early 20th century, Western society, and I call this Western society's conceit. Right. They believe they're on an ascending arc of progress. Except, guess what happened? World War I. and they used all their technology and all their science and all their culture for mass murder. Ostensibly the most sophisticated, educated society in the history of humankind. So what this did was pull the rug out from the rationalist presuppositions.
And we're getting to a point where we're aware of this, we're able to examine this.
And the film brings us back to this.
I do agree with that. I would just like if you could just comment a little bit, and I'll just quote, funny enough, Sigmund Freud, who's addressing exactly what you've just brought up. He, in a letter from one of his friends, he says, he receives a letter. One of these exceptional few calls himself my friend, sends him a letter. And he says, a friend writes about a peculiar feeling which he himself is never without, which he finds confirmed by many others, and which he may suppose is present in millions of people. It is a feeling which he would like to call a sensation of eternity. A feeling as of something limitless, unbounded, as it were, oceanic. Freud then goes on to say that he doesn't understand this, right? And if we could just get back to this idea of, in your dialogic sessions, you've presented, if we can maybe just speak very quickly about Tord Gustafsson, and about the fact, because I think that there are systems of belief and then there are believers, right?
And good distinction.
If we, you know, and belief with a capital B, believers with a small b. And I think that you, in your ability to present the dialogic sessions with people in an interdisciplinary way, you've been able to show us the idea of believers and the fact that belief, you don't have to be being a believer does not mean that you can't believe, that there is something. Can you speak about your experience, say maybe with Tord Gustafsson as an example, where people had this experience and it was not a religious experience, but yet they were able to feel the sacred, and they were able to not feel that emptiness.
Well, the conceit
without a religious framework.
The conceit of institutional religion is to believe that you can box, you can commodify, you can contain belief. And that clearly is not the case. What strikes me in my work with artists, no matter what discipline they work in, is many artists perceive themselves engaged in what I would call a spirit quest. And many people who appreciate their art, whether it be the music of Tord Gustafsson or whether it be a film of Guillaume Tremblay, they likewise see themselves as spiritually engaged, by which they mean this music or this film is touching what I consider ultimate in the human condition. In my lived, Wilhelm Dilthey called it Erlebnis, lived experience. This corresponds to what I consider most important in my lived experience. Now, in the case of Tord Gustafsson, I'm glad you brought him up. Tord Gustafsson is quite clear, as you know, you were there at the dialogic session, that he's a jazz musician, but he's a Norwegian and he's a Lutheran, and he brought up in the Lutheran church, and from early childhood, he associates music and spirituality because of his experience with his parents, with his family, in the church. And this, of course, has led to the northernmost medieval cathedral in the entire world, Nidaros in Trondheim, Norway, commissioning him to do an entire mass. And he sees this as going hand in hand with his jazz, because for him, his art, his jazz, is an extension of his spirituality. And how many poets that I have the privilege of collaborating with would say the same thing, or painters, or sculptors. And this is my PhD work comes out of the study of incarnational theology. And what led me to this is what I would refer to as a false dichotomy. Throughout the history of religions, there's a specific term called Manichaeism. The material is bad, the spiritual is good. But that's a false dichotomy. The reality is that the material and the spiritual go hand in hand. There's a synergy. And even the most spiritual artist expresses that spirituality through material means. Mm-hmm. I believe in the human spirit, but I must confess, Mr. Oscar, I've never seen a human spirit outside a human body. Mm-hmm. They are incarnate. The spirit is infleshed. Mm-hmm. And spirituality, I argue, is infleshed, both on an individual level, and when we're talking culture and national cultures, we're seeing a collective infleshing mm-hmm. of, well, some would call it, Jung would call it, collective consciousness.
Okay. So we're definitely, sort of, one of the things that because my job is to be critical.
Yeah.
And I thought the documentary was and you made very good points. It has put us into a corner to ask very serious questions. I did have one concern about the documentary, and I found it very subtle. I think the first part of the documentary spoke about Quebec's specific situation, and then about the sort of more universal idea of malaise. And then the third part, Emmanuel Schmidt came out and started speaking about his own experience with mm-hmm, Christianity. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, and I guess Spontville probably would have spoken about how even as a non-believer, or mm-hmm. I guess he's a, he's
an avowed atheist.
Yeah, and he talked about what he calls an apostate rage that he had.
Yeah, when he was a teenager.
Especially after May 1968.
Yeah.
And but then he said, as he got older and had kids, mm-hmm. He didn't know. He had to give them some sort of values. Mm-hmm. If we could just do this briefly, then I'll get into a larger thing. I felt a little taken aback by his statement that, this idea of, it seemed almost like his only place to get values was from Christianity. And I started to feel that there was a few people who, throughout the film, like Fred Lenoir says, Christianity is present without giving itself away, without saying its name. I am completely atheistic, I am totally anti-Christian, but I believe in equally human rights, freedom, conscience. And then they say, they have no idea that these values might not even exist in our societies without this source. Mm-hmm. Granted, of course, there is a certain, way, truth, mm-hmm. and life, so mm-hmm. to speak, mm-hmm. in the Christian. But can you? I saw that come up a few times, with even mm-hmm. with Denis Arcand speaking about mm-hmm. The Gospels, and I felt a little uncomfortable sometimes that mm-hmm. there was a little bit at one point in the film of a Christian exceptionalism that was being pushed.
Yeah, so that's a very, very interesting point, and thank you for bringing it up, Mr. Oscar. And you're right, we should be going to this documentary with critical lenses. It cannot answer all the questions. In fact, it rather wants to raise questions than give answers. And keeping in mind that everybody we hear in this documentary comes out of Western, aka Christian society, culture. Mm-hmm. Every single one without exception. Even if they're atheists and take an oppositional stance to organized religion, and very much there's a critique of organized religion in this film.
Definitely, yeah. Definitely.
Denis Arcand is, mm-hmm. He makes a clear and separation between the message of the Gospels and what happened with the church and dogmas and their practice. And so we're hearing a slice of the postmodern world, and it is a Western slice. It is the subtitle in French is it's a post-Christian slice. I say postmodern.
Oh, what is the subtitle?
L'ère post-chrétienne.
Oh, you really translated. That's interesting.
But I propose postmodern because of the presence of people like André Consponville, who makes. He takes, as a scholar and a philosopher, he takes a critical distance. That said, many of the speakers have the honesty to to give us the caveat. For example, the journalist Guy says, okay, look at, there are these values that we hold dear: love, compassion, kindness, forgiveness, generosity. They're not the exclusive domain of Christianity, but it's good to know where we got it from.
Okay, because I was a little concerned, because in the documentary, there was some points where they didn't say not where we got it from, where it came from.
Now I've seen the film 12 times.
Yeah. And
it
was a slippery slope for me, where I felt at times that there was a kind of a Christian exceptionalism, that some of the values of love and compassion, etc., that we have to remember they're from Christianity. I know these are intellectuals. I know they're much smarter than that. But I'm talking about as a viewer, and the fact that just for a moment in the film, I felt a little uncomfortable. That's
well, in all fairness, Mr. Oscar, I think you've got a point, and it's well worth pursuing. So you're right. I mean, if everybody you've got in the film is coming from the Christian culture and tradition, right? You're right on. And you are also correct in saying the overall impression is, I've seen it 12 times. I can't deny it. There is that overall impression. I do appreciate, however, when people like Guillaume or Bernard Raymond, who's an anthropologist, who says, I'm not even sure I could call myself a believer. Right. And you see the cogs in his mind going. Before he says it, he says, to be honest, I don't even know that I could call myself a believer. But then he says, and I also want to point out, yes, we got these values, and what I admire in the film is the emphasis on values, values that are universal for all people, in all places, at all times, whether we be in another geopolitical or geocultural space. The values, I think we would have agreement as a religious studies scholar in my exchanges with Buddhists, with Hindus, with Muslims, with Jews. The film brings out values that many of us are going to agree with, and how I hope that Quebec society, in the wake of the Charter of Values, using the entire notion of values as the thin edge of the wedge in a political campaign.
I mean, the complete embodiment of ideology.
So this
the Charter was.
And that's where I see the value of the film. Getting us out of this pressure, political pressure cooker, and saying, okay, what does really count? And Guillaume makes this incredible distinction. We have it, and I'm summarizing him here, there is what counts and what can be counted.
Yeah, that was.
And to confuse what can be counted with what counts in life is a travesty to the human condition. And Bernard Raymond, he's very careful to say, now wait a minute, folks, there are complete atheists who will have nothing to do with religion. And he says, and they are as good and better than many people. He says, but we have to be fair. On both sides, there's good and bad. So that there are, and André Consponville. One of the revealing moments, to my mind, in this documentary is when André Consponville talks about the conferences he gives on values. And as a philosopher, this is where the rubber meets the road in philosophy. Moral, ethical values. He says, look, when I give a conference and there's hundreds of people out there, and they say, okay, well, you're talking about these values, and you're talking about these values about, as though it were Christianity. Or he says, now wait a minute. He says, I'll ask you in the audience, how many of you have actually invented a value? Which of us in this auditorium has not received the values? And then the question becomes, in intellectual discipline, where did we receive these values from? Well, we received them from Western civilization, which ad fontes has its roots in Augustine, in the city of God, and that's where you see the interstice of religion and society in Western civilization.
Completely agreed. And you know, Bernard Hinault, I mean, I must say that I have found a new person that I definitely want to follow his work. Bernard Hinault definitely, for me, comes back and does save the day for me in terms of what I felt was beginning to be a call of Christian exceptionalism. Because you're right, he does say that he preferred his realization of Christianity as one. This is his quote, preferred his realization of Christianity as one possible avenue from which to anchor and find certain values, but not as some sort of exclusive originary, you know, and he's very careful about that. He says we can be inspired as regards kindness by Christianity. And I agree with that, right? Of course, we're in a day and age where we understand the belief systems. We're in an open field.
That said, your point on Christian exceptionalism is worth elaborating, because the danger here is that we would take part of the truth as all of the truth.
Exactly. Now, one of the things, of course, you know, again, my job is to be critical. And you've already brought it up, actually, ironically. I mean, we've had discussions before, you know the way I think. I'm learning the way you think. Is one of the things that I would like to have seen in the film, to be very frank with you, are other voices that have been in the society for many years. I mean, I can think of somebody like Danny Laferrière. I would love to have seen his reflections on this, because this book, Chronique de la dérivée douce, is a book about the emptiness that he saw when he came to Quebec society. I mean, this is just a comment, but you've already brought it up.
Well, your point is well taken, because in fact, and I should give the readers and the audience some background here. What led, I did not know Guillaume Tremblay. I did not know the film company. It so happened that when I led a public forum with Charles Taylor, unbeknownst to me, Guillaume Tremblay was in the audience.
Oh, wow.
And he was in the middle of making this film. And then other members of the film company started coming to my dialogic sessions. And they said, now look we perceive this documentary as the beginning of dialogue. And therefore, would you collaborate with us so that we will have a series of public forums,
which you will be having,
in which we open dialogue, and including with people that are in the film, like André Consponville, Éric Emmanuel Schmitt, Denis Arcand, and others. So for them, this is how we begin. It's not an ending.
Interesting, because in the film, Jacques Grandmaison, very interesting figure, sociologist, priest, and author, he says, no one possesses the truth. We need all other truths as well. So definitely going the right way in terms of that. Just to go over a few more things. Definitely, you know, we've covered quite a lot already. This idea of the dialogic, do you want to speak about it a little bit in regards to the film and about what you're going to be doing with the sessions that are coming up? And also because, you know, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm interested that you brought up Freud a few minutes ago. Freud, for me, proves quite essential in my understanding of the dialogic imagination. Well, actually, it's my dialogic philosophy of education has now become the subject of research in universities in Germany, France, Canada, and the United States. What led me to this has a parallel with Freud. What contribution did Freud make to us? Of course, he was a physician. He was an MD. And we associate him with psychiatry. But it's important for us to remember that when Freud goes to Paris and conducts his research, he goes as a neurologist, as studying neurology. And what strikes Freud is that he realizes that most of what goes on in the human mind, 99% of it, we're not even conscious of, which brings him to open that whole new vista of the unconscious. And what And what is the parallel here with my dialogic philosophy of education is how can we open up the mind in a learning context so that everybody can avail themselves of what their erlebnis, their lived experience, and what they're not even conscious of. And I relate this here because I've mentioned that I work often with literary figures. Arguably one of the most prominent literary figures in Canada, and indeed the first non-French citizen to ever win the highest award in literature, le Prix Goncourt, is Dr., and I mean, she did her doctorate, though she never uses the name, Dr. Antonine Maillet. She's best known for La Sagouine. Dr. Maillet was my dialogue partner several years ago, and I had all of the people in the seminar reading her work, but I had removed her name because if they knew it was Dr. Antonine Maillet, well, what can I say to Antonine Maillet? And in fact, I'd like to do a dialogic session with Danny Laferrière. I invited him several years ago, but then he got busy, I got busy. The minute the people reading see the name of somebody who's part of l'Académie Française, as Danny Laferrière is now, or the person who won le Prix Goncourt, what can I say to this great literary giant?
But again, that's ideology and belief systems being put in place again.
And part of it is getting beyond what I call the fear factor.
Right.
How do we demythologize learning? How do we create a level learning space so that everybody feels we can learn from each other? Because I believe learning is a synergy. So in the case of Dr. Antonine Maillet, I removed her name, I removed the title of the book, I removed the page numbers, the chapters. All they had was the words. And I invited all the seminar members in a stream of consciousness vein, and that comes from Freud. Write everything that goes through your mind as you read this. Well then, several weeks later, Dr. Antonine Maillet came in, and she could not believe what she heard. And it all had been written intuitively, improvisationally, which explains why I work with jazz composers and musicians like Tord Gustafsson. It had all been written on the spot. We know from neurological studies now that when somebody crosses the street, their mind, unbeknownst, unconscious to them, is carrying on thousands of neurological operations. Well, what this led, when Antonine Maillet heard all of this, she said something, Mr. Oscar, that I will never forget, and I consider the key to my dialogic philosophy of education. She said, creativity is finding out what you know, but you don't know that you know it.
Moving from that, I just have a few more things. If I could just read something which addresses this idea addresses the idea of consciousness. I had mentioned Freud, but I mean I had mentioned Freud more in the sense that Freud was bewildered by this idea of the oceanic feeling. My feelings about Freud are somewhat mixed, of course, but I think that this idea that he brought up, this idea that he had an interest in this oceanic feeling. If I could just read this passage and just have you sort of comment on it. Belief in contemporary society. We've moved away from feudal systems, from the Fordist assembly line. Now people can personally form their sense of self. Things are more, malleable. There's a sense of choice, perhaps. We definitely, for one of the first times in human history, can make our history, insert ourselves in history, but not as one direction is not in just one direction. There's many directions to go. We have the choice to hodgepodge, to take from here and there, and to make ourselves. But there's still the danger of this closing of yourself, right? But what's interesting is that we're at a point where we can construct our own cosmologies, right? But then, as a religious scholar, how do you feel about this time we're in, especially because the film has brought these questions up, definitely. How do you feel about this? Because let's say a person who is using social media, who has a sense of, say, Instagram, who can put their photographs up there and show their world, do you know what I mean? And then there's a system of giving. but it's still within a certain kind of framework of how do you feel about these other systems of possible belief that are coming out there?
Well, you're now addressing a crucial issue. First of all, in the quote from Freud, keeping in mind that Freud is essentially a Victorian figure. He lives right until the beginning of World War II. He escapes from Nazi Austria because it's been taken over. He goes to London, but he's an astute observer, and he sees the industrial era, the age of industrialism, and he's responding to it in the quote that you've given us here. That said, what is the watershed in psychiatry? Keep in mind that at the beginning, just on the cusp, of World War I, who's Sigmund Freud's closest collaborator? They work hand in hand. Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung.
Okay. Well, yeah.
And then the watershed.
Interesting.
They separate in no uncertain terms. And on what basis do they separate? One of the reasons is the role of religion. Freud, as a child of rationalism, where we can create everything ourselves, we are self-contained. Birthed by Darwin. Jung, keep in mind, Jung is the son of a Protestant Swiss-German pastor. Jung first studies theology. Jung cannot bring himself to say that religion has no role in the human condition, much less that it has no role in cultures and entire societies. So this is very important, because Jung realizes, and in that sense validates, the discipline of religious studies, that religion does play a pivotal role, both on the individual level and on the social plane as well. That said, too,
moving to this whole idea of how do you feel about where we are right now, and where people can fashion themselves, where there are other systems of belief out there. People can make themselves, put their ideas out there, and then they can share them and come to some sort of consensus.
There's a basic philosophical distinction here in Latin terms of forma and substantia.
Okay.
We can have the form of complete, full-orbed. Do we have the substance? Okay. And what I see happening in this documentary, Fortunate Shipwreck, is, okay, we've got the form. We have got consumer society. We've got everything we want right now with the Instagram, and we're worldwide, and we're wired to the web. We've got it all. And yet, we seem to lack the substance.
The substance, yeah. So even, unfortunately, after the end of in the open field, as Isaac calls it, where we after ideologies, if we can say that, after the systems of belief as constraint, we're still lost.
Well, we're still searching.
Still searching.
We're still searching. And this gets me back, as a religious studies scholar, to the field of hermeneutics, which is essentially the science of interpretation. And I would maintain, Mr. Oscar, that humans are meaning-seeking creatures. Even in an accident, even in chance, we look... Well, when there's a tragedy that happens in your family, there's been a car wreck, we're going to look for meaning in that. Because we're hardwired hermeneutically to seek meaning, to make sense out of life, which gets us back to the very subject of this film. What is our reason for being? What is the meaning of life? We have this drive in us, even out of chaos, to make order, to find some sort of meaning in it.
And we're going to just a couple more things, because we've covered a lot. I think it is important, again, and this is why I appreciate your work. There's a philosopher from Martinique, and he has this idea of called la nouvelle région du monde, the new region of the world. The fact that, you know, as Father Lacroix does say in the film, he says we can't live without rights, and I agree with this. We can't live without direction, without thought, without dreams, and he's speaking of the quintessential time we live in, after ideologies have this complete hold, where social conditioning becomes massively challenged and questioned. One thing I would say is, and I would, again, we were speaking about a lot of different names. One person who's interested me a lot is Maurice Blanchot, and he has this idea called the community of lovers. And the community of lovers happens in instances, not as a solid mass, as moments. How do you feel about this? Again, I'm pushing you maybe on this, other ideas of believing. How do you feel about this idea of belief versus believing? Other ideas of believing that can exist without ideology, without the constraints of religion.
Well, I think perhaps we can ask ourselves, what new ideologies lie on the horizon? If you're a historian, you see the evolution of ideas and how some morph into others. Darwinism, which was a science, a hard science, morphed into social Darwinism.
Morphed into.
Yes, yes. Yeah, so I think we need to have our radar on
still
and see the big picture, what ideologies lie on the horizon. Now, as we look at the former Soviet Union, and like a phoenix rising from the ashes and now asserting itself, and what would seem to be the rebirth of the Cold War.
Right.
So this is not the Soviet Union, but what will this develop into?
Right.
And China, ostensibly communist, and yet who's winning the game of neoliberal capitalism on a worldwide scale? It's the People's Republic of China.
Right.
Look at their investments in Africa. And now they're buying out Latin America.
Right.
And to say nothing of their investments in northern Quebec, over in western Canada. So I think we want to always hone our vision to look for what's coming next.
Right. Do you have any other comments to add as we finish?
I'm interested that you mentioned Blanchot, because what strikes me, because this relates to Fortunate Shipwreck, L'Heureux Naufrage, what really strikes me in that film is the parallel with a school of philosophy called personalism.
Okay, go ahead.
Which, again, talking about the lost generation, the Western Europeans between the two world wars, people like Gabriel Marcel, who articulate, because they cannot believe in the great ideologies anymore. They've just lived the disaster of World War I, and out of World War I, already the seeds of fascism, of social nationalism. And so they realize that they cannot believe in these meta models for society. They believe it's got to get down to what Martin Buber in a Jewish context would call an I and thou relationship, a personal engagement, and the commitment we have to each other, which of course goes hand in hand with my dialogic understanding of education. That at the end of the day, it comes down to I and thou. And therein lie the ultimate questions and the values that will inform our relationship.
I think we got it. Thank you so much for coming to CUTV and for speaking. And you'll be doing your Dialogic series on September 22nd.
September 22nd, St. John the Evangelist Church, 7 o'clock in the evening. It's only $5. Everybody's welcome. We'll show Fortunate Shipwreck, L'Heureux Naufrage, the director Guillaume Tremblay, and myself. And it's anything goes from that point on.
There's never enough time to speak with you. We're just getting started. Thank you, Dr. Cornett.
Thank you, Mr.
Ah, ben, je sais pas si j'étais plus violent qu'aujourd'hui. J'avais peut-être moins de raisons de l'être dans ce temps-là parce que j'avais pas eu de difficultés chez nous. Puis j'avais été au collège avec les autres. Seulement, je trouvais que c'était insignifiant, la société. parfaitement insignifiant, qui n'avait pas de but pour...
Vous aviez quel âge?
J'avais 17 ans, 16 ans, je pense. Je trouvais qu'il n'y avait pas de but. J'ai fait 2-3 institutions, qui étaient supposées être des bonnes institutions, réguliers, séculiers, puis comme tout le monde de la province. Il a passé. C'est quoi après? D'abord, si on est chrétien, on doit vouloir réaliser ça, ce christianisme-là, l'incarner quelque part, ou de quelque façon que ce soit. Puis même si on n'est pas chrétien, l'énergie qu'on a, on en fait quoi?
Je pense que c'est un événement occidental, pas juste québécois. Il y a peut-être des caractéristiques particulières au Québec. Le fait que personne n'en ait jamais parlé ici.
D'abord, pourquoi c'est caché? Et ça, je pense que profondément, c'est peut-être l'interrogation la plus importante pour moi. Pourquoi ces mots-là sont devenus quelque chose de caché en nous?
On allait trop vite. On a noyé le tout, au lieu de faire le tri.
Un colossal lendemain de brosse, un lancier normal de cheveux. Douleur jusqu'à la moelle de l'os, 30 ans plus pas qu'un petit vieux. C'est en te mirant dans la bolle que ça t'est venu à l'esprit. Où s'envolant quand elle s'envole, y a-t-il un sens à ta vie?
On est quand même dans la seule époque où, quand un garçon de 15 ans demande à son père quel est le sens de la vie, le père se tait.
Et donc tout le problème aujourd'hui du christianisme, c'est qu'il est devenu invisible. Il est présent sans dire son nom. Ce qui fait que vous avez un tas de gens qui aujourd'hui, je suis complètement athée, je suis totalement anti-chrétien, mais je respecte l'égalité de tous les êtres humains, les droits de l'homme, la liberté de conscience, etc. Ils n'ont pas conscience que ces valeurs-là n'auraient peut-être pas pu exister dans nos sociétés s'il n'y avait pas eu le message des évangiles qui en est la source.
Les valeurs auxquelles nous croyons, tous, l'égalité, la liberté, le progrès, etc., si on les coupe de leurs racines, si on oublie d'où elles viennent, comment elles se sont construites au cours des siècles, alors elles vont devenir comme des fleurs coupées qu'on met dans un vase. Et si vous mettez des fleurs coupées dans un vase, au bout de 3 jours, elles sont fanées. Et il arrivera la même chose avec les valeurs auxquelles nous croyons. C'est très important de savoir d'où elles viennent. Ça ne veut pas dire qu'elles sont la propriété des chrétiens, mais ça veut dire que les chrétiens sont pour quelque chose dans leur existence et que c'est bon de le savoir.
Ça n'est pas parce que je suis athée que je vais cracher sur 2000 ans de civilisation chrétienne ou sur 3000 ans de civilisation judéo-chrétienne. Ça n'est pas parce que je suis athée que je vais cesser de voir la grandeur morale, humaine du message des évangiles, par exemple. Et voilà, donc un athée fidèle, c'est un athée qui reste en quelque chose solidaire d'une certaine histoire, d'une certaine communauté qui est la nôtre.
Ça s'est passé, cette histoire-là, dans un temps où du temps, il y en avait encore. À l'époque où le ciel était encore une destination de rêve, à l'époque où c'est là qu'on voulait aller, à cette île de Caxton, nous autres en tout cas, le rêve, c'était pas d'aller dans le sud, on rêvait encore du ciel.
Moi, j'ai un manque, j'ai quelque part un trou, là, il me manque quelque chose. Qu'est-ce que c'est, je ne sais pas. Financièrement, j'ai pas de problème. Dans le métier, même rendu à 62 ans, ça marche encore, les monologues. Et puis il y a encore des jeunes qui disent hey, « Yvon, t'es mon meilleur », puis tout ça. Alors, j'ai pas de raison d'être mal. Je le suis.
À un moment donné ou un autre, dans notre vie, on sent qu'il y a un questionnement ou on sent qu'il y a un moment d'euphorie peut-être, ou de profonde tristesse, mais on sent qu'il y a quelque chose qui est... On ne veut pas le dire. On ne le dira pas, là. On ne le dira pas à nos chums. Mais on le sait qu'il y a quelque chose qui est en train de se produire en nous. Et c'est ça, la spiritualité.
Il y a des gens qui cherchent aussi la vérité, puis qui cherchent aussi à mettre de l'ordre dans leur vie, puis qui cherchent la paix, puis qui cherchent l'amour, le vrai. Et donc, si on se tait, on n'aide personne.
Et donc, j'ai toujours eu un très grand attachement pour les évangiles et pour la personne de Jésus-Christ, qui a toujours été pour moi le personnage, un des personnages les plus importants de l'histoire et un des enseignements les plus fondamentaux, parce que il a été le seul avec le Bouddha, mais encore plus à prêcher, si vous voulez, la charité.
It's the people that made the religion bad. It's people that caused young First Nations to hate religion, to hate tradition, because it was forced upon them. You cannot force someone to believe certain things. That's a personal choice that you make, and we have to respect that choice that people make.
La foi ou la non-foi s'exprime avec honnêteté dans le respect de la foi ou de la non-foi des autres. Donc pour moi, revenir à la question et revenir à l'ignorance partagée, c'est toujours très important. Parce que nous avons tous les mêmes questions, mais nous avons des réponses différentes. Les réponses nous singularisent, les réponses nous différencient. Mais n'oublions pas que nous avons la question en commun. Et que c'est cette question qui nous fait homme. Et c'est cette question qui nous fait semblable. Et notre fraternité, elle est celle de la question.